Imagine a people so small they could fit inside a single modern city. No army, no empire, no towering monuments to their own greatness, just a set of ideas. And yet, those ideas would outlast every superpower of the ancient world, survive centuries of slavery, exile, and attempted annihilation, and go on to shape the moral foundations of Western civilization, democracy, human rights, and the very concept of a single, invisible, all-powerful God. How does a people do that? How do a group of nomads from the ancient Near East change the entire story of humanity? And here is the question that will haunt you through every minute of this video. Did they choose God, or did God choose them? Or perhaps most unsettling of all, did one remarkable, deeply complicated man choose them for both? Stay with us, because the answer is stranger and far more fascinating than anything you were taught in school. Let us go back, way back, to a world that looked nothing like our own. 4,000 years ago, the ancient Near East is a pressure cooker of civilizations. Egypt is already ancient. Babylon is rising. The Assyrians are sharpening their swords. Cities are growing, collapsing, and rising again like waves. Every tribe, every city-state, every kingdom has its own gods. Visible gods, gods carved from stone and painted in vivid color. Gods you can point to, gods you can touch, gods who live in specific temples, on specific hills, in specific cities. In this world, the idea of a single invisible God is not just unusual, it is radical, it is dangerous. It sounds, frankly, insane. And into this world walks a man named Abram. He comes from Ur, one of the most sophisticated cities in the ancient world, a Babylonian city of temples, ziggurats, and a pantheon of gods as crowded as a busy market. Abram is not a young man fired up with the passion of youth when he makes his great move. He is 75 years old. Think about that for a moment. 75 years old, and he uproots everything: his home, his community, his social standing, his entire world, because he believes he has heard the voice of a single God who is unlike all other gods. A God with no statue, no face, no name the human tongue can fully pronounce. A God who makes a promise, a covenant that sounds impossible on its face. Follow me, and your descendants will be a great nation. A God who demands not just sacrifice and ritual, but something far more personal. Is that a religious experience? A vision? A stroke of philosophical genius that arrived ahead of its time? Scholars debate this to this day. But what is not debatable is the result. Abram, later renamed Abraham, set something in motion that will shake the world for the next 4,000 years and counting. Now here is your first pattern interrupt. Abraham was not Jewish. He was a Babylonian. He did not become the father of the Jewish people until his mid-70s. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, three of the most powerful and consequential forces in all of human history, all trace their origin to a man who spent the first 3/4 of his life worshiping someone else entirely. The Jewish God does not begin with a people. The Jewish God begins with one elderly man, a leap of faith, and a journey into the unknown. Abraham and his extended family his tribe, wander into the land of Canaan, the land God had promised. But here is where the story gets complicated immediately. They are nomads in a land that already has people in it. They move, they settle, they move again. They forge a fragile identity around this covenant, this unusual, demanding, invisible deal with an invisible God. And then famine strikes, the kind of famine that does not just empty your stomach, but empties entire civilizations. And so Abraham's descendants, following a son named Joseph, who had been sold into slavery by his own brothers, and had somehow risen to become a viceroy in the most powerful country on earth, make a decision that will define the next 4 centuries of their existence. They go down into Egypt. Egypt in this era is not struggling. Egypt is magnificent. The pyramids already stand. The Nile floods with the precision of clockwork. The pharaohs rule with a hand so iron it bends time itself. And the Hebrews, initially, are welcomed. Archaeologists believe the pharaoh who invites them in is likely a Hyksos ruler, a Semitic king who came to power in Egypt as an outsider himself, and who naturally felt kinship with other Semitic peoples fleeing hardship. For a generation, maybe 2, the descendants of Abraham thrive in the Nile Delta, under the shade of the greatest civilization on earth. And then the wheel turns, as it always does. The native Egyptians rebel against the Hyksos rulers. They drive them out, and in driving them out, they look around at all the foreign peoples the Hyksos had invited in, and they make a decision. These people are no longer guests. They are labor. The welcome turns to whips. The invitation becomes chains. And the descendants of Abraham, who came to Egypt as free people following opportunity, wake up one morning to find they are slaves. Think about what that does to a people's identity. You arrive free. Your children are born free. Your grandchildren are born into chains. And after a generation or 2, the chains begin to feel like the natural order of the world. How many years did this last? Scholars disagree sharply on the timeline, and the exact chronology remains one of the most hotly contested puzzles in biblical archaeology. But the broad agreement is this: it was long, generations long, centuries possibly, under the shadow of the most powerful empire on earth. And nobody comes to save them. Not for a very, very long time. Wait! It gets wilder. When a liberator finally does arrive, he is the most paradoxical and maddeningly enigmatic figure in all of Jewish history. His name is Moses. And here is the staggering thing about Moses. He is raised as an Egyptian prince. He grows up in the palace of the very Pharaoh whose system enslaves his people. He eats at royal tables, wears royal linen, walks marble corridors, and receives an education fit for Egypt's elite. He is, by every outward measure, Egyptian. And yet one day, something breaks. He sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Jewish slave. Something cracks open inside him. Some buried identity, some deep and unnameable loyalty to these people who share his blood but are strangers to his upbringing, surges to the surface. He kills the Egyptian. Moses flees to Midian, where he marries Zipporah, the daughter of a Midianite priest named Jethro. He becomes a shepherd. He spends years tending flocks in the desert, apparently quite content to leave behind both the palace he escaped from and the suffering people he cannot quite bring himself to claim. He is a man suspended between worlds, belonging fully to neither. And then one day, near the mountain of Horeb, a bush burns without being consumed, and the voice of God, who identifies himself as the God of Abraham, issues a command: "Go back. Leave them out." Moses pushes back. He makes excuses. He says he has a speech impediment. He says no one will believe him. He is, according to the text, the most reluctant prophet in history. God has to alternately cajole and threaten him before Moses finally agrees to go. Think about that for a moment. The man who will become the defining figure of Jewish history does not want the job, and perhaps that is exactly why he was chosen. Now here is where the debate becomes truly fascinating, and where we must be honest with you that we are entering territory of scholarly dispute, not settled fact. Sigmund Freud, in his famous and deeply controversial book Moses and Monotheism, argued that Moses may well have been an Egyptian prince or priest, possibly a follower of Atonism, the short-lived monotheistic religion introduced by the reforming pharaoh Amenhotep IV. This pharaoh tried to replace Egypt's entire polytheistic pantheon with a single, abstract sun god called Atum. The priests were furious. A palace revolution swept Amenhotep from power, and the old religion was violently restored. In the chaos of that revolution, says Freud, a man named Moses, a true believer in this dying monotheistic faith, turned to the enslaved Israelites and offered them a deal: freedom in exchange for becoming the vessel of his new religion. Most mainstream scholars today reject or heavily qualify this theory, but it raises a question that is almost impossible to put down. What if the most important figure in Jewish history chose the Jewish people rather than being born into them? What would that say about identity, about destiny, about the nature of faith itself? There is another detail that biblical scholars have wrestled with for centuries. Moses' son was not circumcised, the fundamental ritual sign of the covenant between God and Abraham's descendants. The text says God appeared ready to kill Moses for this transgression. It is Zipporah, his Midianite wife, who quickly performs the circumcision to appease God's wrath. And then there is the question of language. Moses is said to have a speech defect, which is why his brother Aaron served as his interpreter. But some scholars, including Freud, suggest the real reason for an interpreter was not a stutter, but a language barrier. Moses, if he was Egyptian, may simply not have spoken Hebrew. These are debated interpretations, but they reveal something profound about how the Jewish people have always related to their own story. They do not demand clean mythology. They preserve the contradictions. Now we come to the moment that changed everything: the Exodus. 40 years of wandering in the Sinai wilderness. To the modern mind, 40 years to cross a peninsula you can drive across in an afternoon sounds like a punchline. But understand what is actually happening here. This is not a logistics failure. This is a deliberate, agonizing transformation. The generation that knew slavery, that was psychologically shaped by bondage, had to die out. A new generation, born under open skies, raised on stories of liberation rather than the experience of chains, had to grow up in their place. The desert is not a detour. The desert is the curriculum. The desert is where a people learn who they are. And in the desert, Moses gives his people something that will outperform every army, outlast every empire, and outlive every civilization of the ancient world. The Torah, the Mosaic Code. And before you glaze over thinking this is merely a list of religious rules, stop and appreciate what this actually was in its historical context. At the time Moses delivers these laws, Egypt has no written judicial code. Rome will not develop written law for another 1,000 years. The Babylonian Code of Hammurabi exists, yes, but it is a hierarchy of justice, with different punishments for nobles versus commoners. The Mosaic Code says something that had never quite been said before. The law applies to everyone, equally. The stranger, the widow, the orphan, the slave, all standing before the same law. This is not merely a religious statement. This is a constitutional revolution. 3,000 years before the American Constitution, the Mosaic Code was already establishing the separation of civil and priestly authority, the independence of the judiciary, and the principle that individuals could do anything not specifically prohibited. Sound familiar? The American Founding Fathers did not invent these structural ideas. They recovered them. Here is the counterintuitive detail that will stay with you. The 10 Commandments contain only 3 positive instructions. Honor your parents. Observe the Sabbath. Acknowledge God. The other 7 are prohibitions. By fencing in only the negative, Moses left an open field for positive action. This philosophy of law, defining freedom through its limits rather than its permissions, echoes through the centuries directly into the Bill of Rights. Think about this. A group of recently liberated slaves wandering in a desert with no fixed address and no standing army invents the philosophical architecture that 3,000 years later would underpin Western democracy. The world they lived in was a feudal pyramid, rigid as granite. And these former slaves, in a wilderness, were drafting a social contract. Moses never sets foot in the Promised Land. He sees it from the peak of a mountain, and then he dies. His burial place is unknown, deliberately hidden, some scholars suggest, to prevent his tomb from becoming a site of idol worship. He is Judaism's greatest figure, and yet there is not a single Jewish holiday built around a moment in his life. No feast day for his birth, no commemoration of his death. His name appears exactly once in the Passover Haggadah, the annual retelling of the Exodus he made possible. Jews revere Moses. They simply refuse to enshrine him. And in that refusal, they honor his deepest teaching. It is the message that matters, not the messenger. Now we need to talk about the text itself. Biblical scholars have identified at least 4 distinct narrative strands woven through the 5 books of Moses. These are called the J, E, JE, and P documents, named for how they refer to God. The J documents, written around the 9th century BCE in the southern kingdom of Judah, call God Jehovah. The E documents, written about a century later in the northern kingdom of Israel, call God Elohim. These were combined and edited over centuries, with the final version assembled around 450 BCE, 8 to 1600 years after the events it describes. This textual duality reveals a fascinating historical possibility. Before the kingdoms were unified, there may have been two genuinely distinct peoples. The Hebrews, who never went to Egypt, staying in Canaan with a tradition centered on Jehovah, and the Israelites, who came out of Egypt under Moses, carrying a tradition centered on Elohim. The great unification project, the work of judges, kings, and prophets over centuries, was not just political. It was a merger of two peoples, two histories, and two names for God into one nation, one faith, one story. The text carries the seams of that merger, if you know how to look. What follows in Jewish history is not a story of triumph. It is a story of catastrophic, repeated loss and survival so improbable it borders on the inexplicable. The kingdoms are conquered. The temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. The people are carried into exile in Babylon, and in that exile, most ancient peoples simply vanish. They intermarry, they forget their language, they let their gods dissolve into the gods of their conquerors. It happens constantly in the ancient world. It is the normal outcome of conquest. But the Jews sit by the rivers of Babylon, and they write, they compile, they remember. They carry their invisible God with them, and he travels just fine, because he was never tied to a particular stone temple to begin with. You cannot burn a portable God. You cannot melt him down. He lives in a text. He lives in memory. He lives in the practice of laws and the telling of stories. And here is the thought that connects all of this to today. The invisible God, the God of Moses, the God whose second commandment forbade even making an image of him, turns out to be the perfect God for a people who might lose everything at any moment. The survival technology that Moses built in the desert, an invisible God, a portable law, a written text, a culture that passes identity through stories rather than statues, would go on to influence every major civilization of the Western world. The ethical foundations of Christianity are built on it. The legal traditions of Islam echo it. The democratic revolutions of the modern era recovered it. The idea that every human being has inherent dignity before the law, that justice must be impartial, that the powerful have no more right before God than the powerless. These ideas start in a desert, with a reluctant prophet and a people who had nothing left to lose. Whether Moses was a Hebrew, an Egyptian, or a Midianite, whether the God of Abraham and the God of Moses were originally the same or merged together by later editors, whether the Exodus happened exactly as described or in some different form that archaeology has not yet fully recovered. None of that erases what the Jewish people actually did with these ideas. They took the most radical ethical vision the ancient world ever produced, and they carried it forward through every catastrophe, every exile, every attempt to extinguish it. For 4,000 years, the Jewish God is not just a deity in a religious text. The Jewish God is the first God in human history who demanded moral behavior rather than merely ritual obedience. The first God who cared how you treated the stranger and the widow, not just whether you had brought the right sacrifice to the temple. the first God who lived not in a building, but in the relationship between a people and their own highest values. And that idea, that extraordinary, disruptive, world-changing idea, is still alive, still shaping law, still fueling arguments about justice, still haunting philosophy and politics in ways that most people never trace back to their origin. So, the next time someone asks you what Jewish history is, you can tell them, it is the story of how a small people with no army and no empire changed the moral vocabulary of the world. It is the story of a God so revolutionary that even his enemies could not entirely escape his influence. And it is a story that, 4,000 years after it began, is still very much unfinished. If this journey through the origins of Jewish history and the Jewish God moved you, challenged your assumptions, or made you see something familiar in a completely new light, hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to this channel. And subscribe, because we are only at the beginning of this story. Next time, we go deeper into the wars of the Israelite kings, the rise of the prophets, the destruction of the temple, and the long, extraordinary, almost incomprehensible story of how a people survived the unsurvivable. Trust us, it only gets more astonishing from here.